Good evening. My name is Fumio Nanjo. I am the director of Mogi Art Museum. Now, against the backdrop of COVID-19, we will be discussing the new age post-COVID and with COVID. We will be taking up the topic of a pandemic and innovative city. We have started on the 16th, and we will be running this event until the 27th. I'm in charge of the art and science session, and the three themes are understand the reality, empathy for others, and collaborative creativity. So it's understanding, empathy, and collaboration are the three topics we are going to be discussing in this art and science session. This is the fourth day of the art and science session. And as we saw in the U.S. presidential elections, I think diversity has been emphasized further, coming to the fore. And against this backdrop of diversity, we should consider the possibility of formulating common rules. Today's moderator will be Dr. Asa Ito. We have three speakers for the session. We are looking forward to a stimulating session. Ito-san, please. Good evening. My name is Ito. I was the moderator for Friday last week, and I am in charge of the topic of empathy for others. This is the second session we are holding for the empathy for others, and the sub-theme will be technology in human relationships, searching for a new common ground, empathy for others. So today's theme is technology in human relations, and I am here with my friend. Can you see her? This is called, she is called Orihime. She is a telepresence, a robot. It's different to the type of robot. There is a human being represented in this robot. This robot is operated by a person, a human being, remotely. Inside is Sae-san, my friend. And she is operating this robot remotely. Sae-san, can you hear me? Yes. I can hear you. I'm looking forward to the session today. This is very strange. This is really Sae-san in telepresence. And I can feel her presence here. It was very interesting because the staff, when they were preparing, they tried to plug something in to her. And it was in the back of the robot. And the staff was very careful in making sure that she is not to trouble the robot. So she really is like a human being, and I can feel Sae-san close to me. And I'm sure that Sae-san feels that she is taking part in this session. Are you feeling nervous that you are here with us? Yes, it feels like I'm at the studio. It's different to the online video conference. I feel very nervous in front of everyone. So please enjoy the session today, Sae-san. Yes, I'm looking forward to it very much. Now, I came to know Sae-san after COVID-19. I am researching the body of the human being. Against the backdrop of COVID-19, the body that I was considering was very limited prior to COVID. It is not the human flesh that is the body. It goes much more beyond that, which is the human body. And we have remote lectures and remote meetings. And Sae-san has been working remotely even prior to the COVID-19. She's even gone overseas in travel even though there is less encounter with human beings, I think I was able to study how humans can interact without bodily contact. So with COVID-19, the boundary of what we can do and what we can't do are becoming different. This is what is referred to as the new normal. So when the line drawn will differ, the disabilities as well as persons like Sae-san's will become more important. When I was talking to a blind person, there was a significant insight that I was able to obtain. Zoom is a visual tool, so I thought that it cannot be used by people with vision impairment, but that is not the case. They are using vision impairment. And it's easier for them to understand because they don't use pronouns anymore because they're not sharing the physical space. So people speak clearly when they are on Zoom. So this is very helpful for people with visual impairment as well. And in Zoom, when you discuss, sometimes we overlap, and that is a problem that frequently occurs. But that was something that visually impaired people, blind people, were experienced from the past as well. Because we can ask people to speak when they seem they want to speak, but that is not the case for blind people. So they often encounter instances where they overlap with each other. But with Zoom, it's very important to designate people who are going to speak, and therefore Zoom is very helpful for such occasions. So what we can do and what we can't do, we are drawing different lines to segment this. And in fact, I think we can learn so much more from people who have disabilities. We will be discussing this in the context of the technology and human relationship. But and this is a topic that is being discussed from the past. Now with the advent of COVID-19, more important essential factors are increasingly coming to the fore. So this is the topic we are going to be discussing. We have three speakers for this session. I would like to introduce them in the order of their presentation. First, Dr. Kenichiro Mogi, brain scientist of the senior researcher of the Sony Computer Science Laboratory. The second speaker will be from overseas, Dr. Mara Mills, Associate Professor of Media Culture and Communications of New York University. We're looking forward to hearing from Dr. Mills. I hope you can hear. And next will be Dr. Tatsuhiko Inatani, Associate Professor of the Graduate School of Law from Kyoto University. So these are the members who will be presenting. To the right of your screen, you should have the Slido appearing. We'll be listening to the presentations from the speaker now. While you listen, please give us any feedback that you would like to share. Without further ado, we would like to receive the presentations from the speakers. First, Dr. Mogi, please.
Hi guys, I'm Mogi and I'm going to speak in Japanese. So, 僕の話は
Human is the message is the topic I would like to talk about. I was asked to produce a PowerPoint presentation material, but I didn't know that, so I just do it right now.
I just made it on the spot, so I don't know what's happening. But anyway,
Well, speaking of the city, I think one of the most creative cities in the world, that is Tokyo. The environment is extremely important. Stadtmacht, fried. the city makes everything free. That's a German proverb. Just like Banksy, he comes to a city and you, for example, in New York, that Banksy comes frequently to New York. And how many times can he come to Tokyo? I'm hoping that Tokyo Olympics will be able to held, but the Banksy, for example, including the street artists, they have to come over to Tokyo Olympics, and that's going to be a very good thing. That Nanjo-san is a very famous professor.
I guess so.
Yeah, so yeah, we have that really famous gentleman there. But anyway, で
How the brain recognizes beauty. Functional MRI is used in order to see golden ratio. When it is viewed by the brain, the reward system is being analyzed, and as you can see, this area is quite active. Speaking of art, new things come one after another. In Tokyo, subculture, for example, Takashi Murakami, is quite active in this area. Bottom up instead of top down. This is the culture that we have in Japan. Now, what is being highlighted these days is Running Till the Night. This is a very popular music which has been repeated over 1 million times on the internet. And the composer was Ayase-san, a Vocaloid producer, or Vocaloid P for short. So he produced this song. This is the Yamaha invented the system, and the computer made music and can be played and performed. And then Ikura Rira-san, who is a singer and sings that song. The title is Running Till the Night, and it is a big hit. And this title, the music, came from the story. And that story comes from monogatari.com. This is a site where stories can be shared. Monogatari.com had one of these stories, and Vocalo P. Ayase-san composed a song, and then that Ikuta-san sang that song. Now, we often look to the content in the first place, but what kind of media, what kind of a context, and that is also the source of a newness. Therefore, I think Dr. McLuhan was one of the most important figures in this area. And the media is the message. That is his famous word. This is a word with a huge depth, I should admit. Tokyo is an innovative city, I should say, but in thinking about that, what is important is going to be this message. The medium is the message Katsuya Hokusai that drew the wood painting that described the high waves of Kanagawa Sea. And the distribution system over the wood paintings, there was such media system was in place, and that was because Hokusai's famous paintings were born. Therefore, when it comes to this song, the Running Till the Night, there were Vocalo P's, and also those the story writers' website, aside from those famous novelists. And with this kind of these things in place, that we were able to have that kind of thing. I think Roppongi and Tokyo itself is such a creative city, I should say. And in order to develop further, I think the embodiment of the media, how the network is going to be established, that is important. In Roppongi, the Mori Museum, for one thing, is a source of creating or inventing new media and media arts. This kind of crowdedness is extremely important. It is something that we miss under the COVID outbreak, but this kind of a crowdedness serves as a source of the newness.
processes and so on. And それで僕はすごく大事だと思うのは、
Now, what is important is when it comes to happiness, I think as captured in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness on the individual scale is extremely important. It is not determined as the state, but individually, the people have to decide what is happiness, and they should be given the right to pursue happiness. And in this way, art can be created, that individually the people can determine what is art, and in this way art can be created and invented. Utility function, if I may use a scientific term, that means what is beautiful and what is happiness, how is this going to be defined? That's an issue. For example, in terms of autonomous driving, how the algorithm is going to be determined, how to prioritize pedestrians or people on board. For those who violate the traffic regulations, how they are going to be protected and who are going to be protected in the first place. Algorithm should be given this task to determine. Now, utility monster is one concept that we often come across. For example, that utility function in society, if there is an authoritarian state and the tyrant as happiness is going to be prioritized, and that is not a good thing. Therefore, in society, we have to balance the utility functions of a lot of people. That is supposed to constitute a public welfare. In the United States, I think the private institutions are engaged in AI institution. Eliezer Yudovsky. Now, he only graduated from junior high school. He is a genius, as a matter of fact, and he released very interesting ideas. For example, friendly artificial intelligence. AI does not go against the interest of human beings. This is his concept. And coherent extrapolated volition, which is a term that was coined by him. Instead of prioritizing someone's happiness, but the process for decision making should be discussed. This is what coherent extrapolated volition stands for. There is a deep division among American population over the presidential election, but what should be the most important thing for the happiness of all people? Maybe we can rely on AI to think about that. Now, in the ethical decision making, embodiment is extremely important. In particular, temporal parietal junction, or TPJ, its activity is extremely important, and this plays an important role linking the body and the mind. Now, as for the Constitution of Japan, after Japan was defeated, GHQ that had an important role in coming up with this constitution. I will not go into all the details because we have the presence of a professional here, but it also says the pursuit of happiness. There are a lot of authoritarian states around the world. They are not free politically, but the leaders often say that their people are quite happy. The state is not something, the happiness is not something the state provides. But instead, individuals should have the right to pursue happiness. And in fact, this underlies the source of art. We have different embodiments depending on the people. Orihime-kun, the avatar robot. Now, we have different embodiments, and based on that, we are different people. Inside Tokyo, we have 10 million people with a different embodiment. We are living in a global village. Well, I only have 5 minutes left. So 7 billion people are living on this globe with different embodiments. So human is the message I would like to deliver today. McLuhan said the medium is the message. But my The translation is human is the message, which is extremely important for the youth future. We are all different. We are living in different contexts. Therefore, we have to pursue happiness on our own, and the way of expression differs. Human is the message, is the concept. Here in this forum, I would like to propose. Thank you very much.
ありました。
Thank you very much. Next, we would like to hear from Dr. Mara Mills. Please.
マラさんお願いします。
Ari.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Terrific. Thank you so much to Dr. Ito for the invitation to present at this forum, and also thank you to the interpreters for working with me today. I'm going to talk to you about the Center for Disability Studies, which I co-founded with Professor Faye Ginsberg at New York University, and an archiving project that we've been working on to document the experiences of people with disabilities and chronic illnesses during the COVID-19 pandemic in New York, mostly New York, since April. Disabled people, especially people of color and those living in nursing homes or hospitals or other congregate housing, have been at greatest risk of infection and death from COVID-19 in the United States. So we have been assembling a publicly accessible archive to be housed at one of the NYU libraries, the Tamiment Library, which we are calling Disability COVID Chronicles. And we're collaborating with community members to preserve memories, stories, artworks, like this mural that you see by a deaf artist who goes by the name Cello Man on a window on this slide, and other materials in a range of accessible formats. Next slide. We're also preserving conversations on social media, records of digital public meetings, and photographs of street art and actions that are otherwise ephemeral. This slide is just an image of our homepage that's about to launch that people can use to donate to the archive. Our goal is not to chronicle only vulnerabilities of people with disabilities, but creative initiatives for survival under these new conditions that are structured by old inequalities. From a technology and design perspective, which is the theme of this panel, we hope to amplify the community knowledge as well as the everyday micro affordances, to borrow a phrase from Canadian disability scholar Arceli Dokumachi, of architecture and technology that disabled people routinely deploy. We also use Professor Cassandra Hartblay's concept of disability expertise, which extends the familiar notion of lay expertise from the field of science and technology studies and medical sociology, joining it with a focus on disability activism and justice. The well-known American disability activist Alice Wong reminded her blog followers of disability expertise in the early weeks of pandemic disruption. So she wrote on her blog in April, "For many disabled, sick, and immunocompromised people, we have always lived with uncertainty and are skilled in adapting to hostile circumstances in a world that was never designed for us in the first place. Want to avoid touching door handles by hitting the automatic door opener with your elbow? You can thank the Americans with Disabilities Act and the disabled people who made it happen." So that's an example of disability expertise from Alice Wong. The preliminary interviews we have collected for our archive have shown us how disability activists have used their hard-won insights to interrogate, hack, and redesign public infrastructures and online platforms to guarantee access and public visibility. Such innovative work falls broadly under the purview of what is known as design justice. This is a term from Sasha Costanza-Chock, a professor at MIT, in a new book from 2020. The intersection of disability and technical expertise is currently a burgeoning field in the United States, with several new books published this year, timed to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. This scholarship takes design as a category encompassing architecture, digital media, and other elements of the built environment. The design justice approach focuses equally on disabled designers. And there's a recent anthology from Bess Williamson and Elizabeth Guffey from 2020 on disability and design that has a focus on disabled designers. And it also emphasizes everyday people for whom disability is an ingenious way to live. These are the words of Neil Marcus, under and despite conditions of discrimination. I should also say that in our archiving project, we take disability to be a very diverse category, defined broadly. And here I'm borrowing from Patty Byrne of the activist collective Sins Invalid, her definition of disability as including people with physical impairments, people who identify as sick or chronically ill, psych survivors and those who identify as crazy, neurodiverse people, people with cognitive impairments, people who are a sensory minority. So we're interested in documenting a similarly wide range of experiences related to the pandemic, not limited to those who have contracted the virus, experiences of quarantine, remote work and unemployment, caregiving, stigma, activism, teletherapy, medical rationing, and art making. And to our knowledge, this is the only American archive of the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 that focuses explicitly on experiences of disability. So I'm going to give you a few examples of what the team has learned from our interviews so far. The first examples emphasize technology or architecture, and my final example will discuss disability arts. Next slide. I just want to show you who the group is. This is the professors who are writing the grants and leading the group. Myself, my colleagues Faye Ginsberg and Raina Rapp, anthropologists, and Arthur Kaplan, who is a bioethicist. And the next slide. Next. Thank you. And these are the graduate student and postdoctoral researchers whose work I will be sharing with you. Victoria Grubbs, Harris Kornstein, Emily Lim Rogers, Kara Idris, Nadia Mbande, and Jan Grenier. He's a postdoc from Montreal. The others are working in New York. Okay, I'll give you the examples now. Next slide. Emily Lim Rogers, who is the graduate student manager for the Center for Disability Studies, has been extending her ethnographic dissertation research with the MECFS, or chronic fatigue community, some of which she has recently published in the anthropology blog Somatosphere. People with MECFS self-describe as canaries in the coal mine. And recent research shows that MECFS, which has long been considered a medical mystery, is often catalyzed by coronaviruses, making this once suspect and medically marginalized syndrome the subject of intense current biomedical interest, particularly given increasing reports of post-COVID-19 debility. So Emily writes, these canaries have a second valence. They anticipated the social isolation generalized to the currently able-bodied public in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. A lively, ongoing conversation among disability communities on Twitter is about the many lessons COVID-19 has taught able-bodied people. Put quite aptly by Kyla Schuler, COVID-19 is teaching the ableds what the disabled and chronically ill already know. Your ability to leave the house is a privilege that can be lost at any time. Emily writes, in real ways, people with chronic illnesses, and especially people with MECFS, for whom the defining characteristic of their disease is how it drains them, are some of the only people for whom COVID-19 has changed very little about their day-to-day lives. And you can take a look at her piece on Somatosphere for more of this argument. Now, Raina Rapp and Faye Ginsberg, my anthropology colleagues at NYU and the co-directors of the COVID Chronicles Project, have found much more profound everyday changes for adults with intellectual disabilities in New York who they are interviewing, especially those who live in congregate housing like nursing homes, people who've been at the greatest risk of infection and death. Long marginalized and mired in slow-moving bureaucratic responses, this group of advocates, people with intellectual disabilities and their family members, now find themselves at the forefront of rethinking what it means to live at extremely high risk. Rapp and Ginsberg's research and their interviews have included following online discussions, and they've done this for years, regarding what are called self-direction programs. They are following the disability activist group ADAPT's Access Across America efforts to establish a national program to help people with disabilities avoid nursing homes because they cannot get affordable, integrated, safe, and accessible housing. And they're also following locally the New York Queens Council on Developmental Disability, which is piloting an innovative, non-certified housing individualized program with community supports called Wraparound Service. And Wraparound Service includes 3 options for community living rather than living in segregated in an institution, which is high risk for COVID. And these 3 options include living with families, a caretaker, or on one's own with assistance. Now, this may seem extremely obvious or extremely basic in countries that have national healthcare systems, but in many parts of the United States, government health insurance will only pay for medical assistance in a hospital or nursing home, not at-home assistance, which is why it's usually too expensive for people to live more safely outside of congregate housing. So rethinking medical funding, but also rethinking architectural spaces has been a huge piece of action after COVID in New York. Next slide. Jan Grenier, who is our SSRC postdoctoral fellow, he's working remotely in Montreal. He's been following the problem of congregate housing in Montreal, and we can compare his work to Faye Ginsberg and Raina Rapp's work. And he's especially been following the recent protests and demonstrations of disability activists who are seeking safer, independent living situations in Canada. Grenier writes about the most famous protests recently held by Jonathan Marchand, who, quote, is a young man who uses a ventilator to help him breathe and has been forced to reside in long-term care for the elderly, even though he's not old, in the Quebec region for the last 10 years due to the lack of services to ensure his home support. And he led a brilliant action in August of 2020. And this, again, are the words of Jean Grenier, where he caged himself in a makeshift tent in front of the National Assembly of Quebec to claim his right to live in an apartment of his choice and to receive the services to which he is entitled by the law. His protest lasted 5 days and 5 nights as he refused to leave his cage until he had met with government officials and concluded a deal for himself and others, demanding that the home support programs and the model of the institution would be thoroughly revised. So COVID, again in Canada, created a situation of urgency as people were massively dying in these nursing homes. And also as people in Canada were learning that triage protocols were discriminating against people with disabilities from receiving treatment. Jan Grenier tells me that at the end of his protest, Jonathan Marchand was assured by the Canadian government that a committee would be set up to examine in detail to review initiating home care services and assistive living facilities, and that there would be an emergency solution so that he could get out of the elderly home care. But at the time of this talk, Jonathan is still residing in a nursing home, and the promises are very slow to materialize. Another student, Nadia Mbande, who is an anthropologist, has been studying mental health challenges for Black women, especially in New York, in the context of the Black Minds Matter movement, and she has been collecting interviews with those activists for our archive. Mental health challenges have also been exacerbated under pandemic conditions for most Americans who have lost work, resources, and schooling, and live with deep anxiety, uncertainty, and loss, and fear about exposure to COVID. These challenges have been, or they have disproportionately impacted people of color and those with underlying medical issues. And this is especially true in the US for Black families who, because of longstanding economic and social inequalities, are more likely to live in crowded housing arrangements, especially in New York, who often cannot work from home, given their disproportionate labor force participation as essential workers. They may be parents of young children needing daycare and schools, which are closed during working hours, and many of whom experienced the impact of or participated in the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests this summer and the national conversations it launched. So for all these reasons, Nadia is working with various mental health support groups to collect qualitative interviews with Black women. She's looking at innovative new projects on racism and mental health trauma, like crisis assistance helping out on the streets or Cahoots. And next slide. And she's also looking at Correct Crisis Intervention Today, CCIT, which is a group in New York City. These groups have proposed remote peer crisis interventions to replace policing when people who are having extreme mental health crises call for help, or when strangers or neighbors either tend to call the police, which creates huge problems for them. So she's been following remote peer crisis interventions and also interviewing mental health activists. And I have two more examples, and then I'll be finished. Anthropology PhD student Kara Ryan Idris has been collecting virtual interviews by Zoom with a different group, with autistic adults living in the New York area. And she's discovered a few instances in which people's lives have actually improved since the start of COVID, which is very different than what we've heard from our other researchers. Although many of Kara's interlocutors have experienced depression, illness, and isolation because of COVID-19, the majority of the autistic adults that she interviewed are marginally employed, and if they are employed, they have low-wage jobs in the city. And this has meant that receiving unemployment insurance and pandemic relief in the spring, as minimal as it has been in the United States, it still provided a welcome change for some people at the very bottom of the economic ladder or who are unemployed. For instance, Fabio, an autistic man in his early 30s who Kara interviewed, she writes, he's back at work now as a barista in a coffee shop, but he was temporarily unemployed when the coffee shops he worked at were closed from March through May when she interviewed him. Unemployment insurance and the one-time stimulus check he received allowed him the chance to temporarily live the way he wants to live life, as he put it, rather than making money in a largely unfulfilling job just to pay rent. He explained to Kara that being out of work, but still receiving enough money to live, and in fact, he received more money from unemployment than he usually makes in his very low-paying barista gig. It gave him the ability to truly structure his days the way he wanted, to watch a film, to become immersed in reading a novel, to read about politics, to edit photos. These are just some examples. And next slide. And this is my last slide. So finally, my own research over the past several months has focused on the online world-building activities of disability artists. Early in the pandemic, I followed the online activism, mutual aid, and performance projects of a number of disability artists and dancers and scholars. And I published a brief survey of these artistic experiments in the journal Contactos, in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, co-authored with Faye Ginsberg and Raina Rapp. You can find the link on my website if you're interested. I'll give you one example. Critical Design Lab, which is a group of people including Amy Homry, a professor at Vanderbilt, partnered with DJ Who Girl, Kevin Gotkin, a professor and also a DJ, to throw a series of what they were calling remote access parties or CRIP nightlife gatherings, still ongoing, starting on March 22nd, in which they created a very early set of public protocols for improving the accessibility of Zoom. Just as everyone was starting to get onto Zoom, they were trying to figure out ways to make it as accessible as possible. Open to the public, their online announcement reminded everyone, and this is, I'll read from this page, that disabled people have long used remote access as a method for organizing pleasure and kinship. Attendees at their parties receive participation guides that explain why Zoom is not an ideal platform. They say things will not work perfectly, but one still tries one's best. Their events include live captioners and sound and video describers, as well as what they call access doulas, people who are asked to troubleshoot any access problems that arise during an event. They have 100 or more people attending their online parties. They include music, visual slideshows put together by various disability artists that are described, sometimes fashion shows, and I think they have another one coming up in December. So to briefly conclude, this is just a small snapshot of some of the materials and memories that we're including in our COVID Chronicles archive. And in addition to the value we hope this archive of the present will have for future disability activists, artists, documentarians, and scholars, we think the collection documents the influence of this unanticipated public health crisis on the everyday lives of disabled people, mostly in New York, also in Montreal, and how these changes are enduring over time. We expect to run the interviews for about 2 years to see how it reshapes the body politic. Thank you.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。マラミルさん、ありがとうございます。はい、それでは最後のスピーカー。
Thank you very much, Dr. Mills. Last speaker will be Dr. Inatani. This is Inatani of Kyoto University. I have also prepared some slides to share with you. Now, today's talk is Rule of Law After Humanism. And I have prepared this in English for Dr. Mills, but I will speak in Japanese. Now, this is Yamane-san. In this photograph, her right leg is prosthesis, and now the understanding was that something is missing from the body by wearing prosthesis, but in fact that is to realize the possibilities that we do not have. And the prosthesis is being shown here as a part of the body, and she's very active. So the way people exist, humans exist, is diversifying. Therefore, by the same token, the rule of law will also undergo change with the introduction of technology. That is the topic I would like to share with you. Let me first of all introduce myself. My name is Inatani. I'm Associate Professor of Law at Kyoto University. I'm also a visiting researcher at RIKEN AIP. I am a specialist in terms of criminal policy, and also focus on law and technology. The integrated approach for sanction policy analysis encompasses philosophy, sociology, economics, and cognitive science to have a multidisciplinary approach to criminology. Now, I am proposing a non-modern resolution alternatively to a modern law. And which is based on strict division between subject and object, or assumption of human beings as an autonomous agent. That is the basis of modern law. But I would argue that something non-modern can be very effective. Let me talk about why I am pursuing this area. First and foremost, Society 5.0 has been introduced, and with that, AI has been incorporated into autonomous machines. This is the society that we are living in today. That means that there will be interaction between humans and machines that work autonomously. In this interaction, in the context of law, the subject and object relationship will be difficult to be maintained, as you can see in the first bullet point. When you use a smartphone, the search history will be taken into consideration to provide options based on AI in the smartphones. Amazon is also very similar. Suggestions will be made. And the machine will be learning our preference. So it is not just a tool for sending email, but rather suggestions will be made to human beings. So it is increasingly becoming a partner for the human beings, even in sometimes we may be driven by the suggestions made by the smartphones, meaning that if anything, the smartphone is a master rather than a partner. In the case of autonomous driving system, this is the level 2 of Tesla. On the left hand side, there are some litigation pending, but with high-level autonomous driving system, when human beings are using such a system, it's very difficult to maintain attention when the possibility of occurring is very low. So when the car is being driven, and if something unexpected occurs, so it'd be very difficult to ask for intervention. That means that there has to be an interface or design in order to maintain the attention of the human being. Otherwise, it will be prone to accidents. And agency is very important. Is it myself that is driving this, or are we driven by the machine? This agency will be impacted by autonomous driving system. In the Tesla autonomous driving system from level 2 means that human being will be responsible. That is the reason why the car can be driven. But is there true agency? It could be impacted by design. It could also be impacted by the AI as well. So we have to redefine what agency means in this context. So the product that is dominated will become penetrable relationship. And this is a challenge that we have to find solutions for. It is becoming increasingly to the fore. In the area of philosophy, this same topic is being discussed. Natural Born Cyborg is a very famous book by Andy Clark, a philosopher. According to this book, human beings are such that our behavior is not just using tools, but it is augmented by tools. Cognitive ability can be supported by tools. So we can't make complex calculations without pen and paper and pen. And that means that information processing is part of our brain, but we have to outsource that to paper and pens. By so doing, our ability can be augmented and expand our activity. When we think about this, Peter Paul Frederick is also talking about this point. The same for cars, for air conditioners, as well as telephones. These objects have developed into tools beyond the inventors. It will increasingly intervene into our existence. Smartphone is a good case in point. This is a very interesting tool. It is for communication. That is the purpose of this tool. But with the cellular phones, there is an ethical problem that is coming to the fore. Meeting someone has changed. Now, when smartphones didn't exist, we had to set up appointment times. But now, if we oversleep or if we forget, the telephone can be made and rearrange the appointment, and they will be able to meet. So the meaning of promise of meeting has undergone change. In the case of Japan, the notification for a crime has been increasing because of the smartphones, because it's easier to make a notification. But that was not expected by the inventor of smartphones. Now, things are increasingly intervening to human beings' activities. It is becoming autonomous, and having a better relationship with this thing, we have been able to expand the scope of as a species. As a species, we are human species, but body embodiment is different, as Professor Mogi has mentioned. Orihime is another embodiment. That means that we are multi-species in a sense. If that is the case, the modern law is based on the concept of human beings in a rigid sense. But it would become difficult to maintain this concept going forward. In the context of humanism, we have human rights. Human beings, in this regard, is idealized figure of human of a particular culture, place, and time, and it will not apply to everyone. So, but if we try to maintain this concept, for example, white man in the Christian world is a case in point. If this model is maintained, and autonomous human being is maintained, and the control, if maintained, that means that there will be increasing, with increasing interaction between humans and machines. We don't know whether this will become viable anymore. There are designs and interfaces that will have to change over time. And when we focus on this point, how we do things now should be reviewed. The human rights is based on majority, and minorities, for minorities, it could be more difficult. If that is the case, then the way we do things should be subject to review, and other ways of doing things must be pursued. So what are the alternative ways is what Foucault and other philosophers' views will be taken into consideration. The right way is to be the context where a pursuit of happiness is to be made. Then perhaps this is not required, but currently we don't know how we should live better lives. The relationship with the human beings and technology has to be reviewed from scratch. That means that we have to consider what do we want to be, and this question has to be answered. Disabled people should be included further. That has been mentioned. This kind of perspective should be incorporated as well. It should encompass as many people as possible, so that everyone can live the lives that they want to live. So that means that what do we want to be should be at the center of designing systems. And this must also be pursued in the context of law as well. That's the second point. In the interest of time, I would like to share with you my conclusion. So we cannot identify what is the essence of human beings. So we have to depart from the essentialized concept of human rights. We have to make sure that there is a place for a discussion, and based on that, we have to redefine rights. For example, in the law system that we are proposing, the design is very important. In the past, the bureaucracy will lay down the requirements for the design, but now increasingly the proposals are made from the corporations, and which will be presented to the bureaucracy. Within the phase to take a democratic approach, the users, people who will be impacted, their views must also be incorporated as much as possible. And this will become the new value leading to innovation. That is what I am proposing. That means that incentives will have to be provided so that people will participate in this process in good faith. And the collective knowledge must be the basis of providing happiness to as many people as possible. This is how the legal system must undergo change. In the past, the penal code defined what can be done, what should not be done, and the way human beings should be living was at the basis, and anyone who is not abiding by that will be subject to sanctions. But what is going to be necessary going forward is what is correct and what is a better way of living must be discussed in good faith. The focus should be on that, and the people who do not want to participate, we have to provide incentives so that they will also participate. And rather than normalization, a better way of living should be pursued by as many people as possible. I think this will lead to a better society for all. And with that, I would like to conclude. Thank you.
どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you. Well, having listened to the three panelists' presentations, they were deeply linked with each other. Mr. Mogi was talking about the humanism message. So with the different embodiments and bodies, there are four. They have their own versions of happiness, and they have the right to pursue their own happiness. And Professor Mills, the different types of happiness depending on the status of the body and physical situation. And what was quite symbolic is Fabio-san's example. Because of the outbreak of the pandemic, he was working in a cafe, and it was just for living. But because of the pandemic, he lost his job. But instead, relying on the benefits and unemployment allowances, he started to seek his own way of life, reading books and other things. I think that was quite symbolic. Professor Inatani's talk was related to the legal background with regard to different kinds of forms of happiness. According to the conventional law, the modern humans, they are supposed to be the basis. But when it comes to this kind of a general image of modern human beings, there are different kinds of people out there. Therefore, they are should be linked with the technology progress. How they are going to be retranslated is going to be an important matter. Now, I would like to drop a couple of questions to all of you. And in Mr. Inatani's presentation, with the progress of technology, I think the subject and the object, they are not going to be separated easily. And this is a new situation we are facing. And in light of that, how is this going to be linked with the concept of happiness? In some cases, I think that the responsibility should be taken care of by the person. And in such a situation where responsibility is not going to be clarified, it may be difficult and to what the happiness should be. Professor Inatani, over to you. Thank you for your very good question. So allow me to respond to that question with my own view. As you are correct. I think that this is the privilege and to be accounted for the responsibility. I do understand that in such a situation, within related to the talk I was talking about, for example, in the case of autonomous driving, it is difficult to determine to what extent the driver is going to be responsible. Well, according to a specific and unique culture, that may be one thing, but in the legal world, it is going to be different. So there are going to be people who believe in the world where the responsibility is clear enough. But that is not going to be in the form of one single form of happiness. Therefore, once again, in what way each person will be able to enlarge their area of happiness or have some compromise with regard to each version of happiness. That kind of space has to be generated. And this is going to be a way out of the conventional modern society. The modern society believes that kind of aspect that should be full controlled. But there should be more expansion of the area for free discussion. Professor Mills, AI now, at the New York University, I think you've been talking about and discussing the relationship of happiness and AI. What do you think? Can you share with us your views?
Wonderful colleagues at the AI Now Institute, which is also affiliated with NYU, and the Center for Disability Studies last year did a report on disability bias and AI with them, a white paper. If you're interested, I could. It's linked on my website. But the question of happiness is an interesting one, and because most of the interviews that we've done have focused on people's negative feelings of fear and grief and depression and anxiety, especially living in a country like the United States that doesn't have a strong social security system or safety net. So happiness and trying to create happiness becomes really a political act. And you pointed to the small story of Fabio, as well as many of the other autistic adults that Kara Idris interviewed. She found that many people who already lived with economic security were actually able to have slightly better economic opportunities, ironically, after COVID. And that provided them with happiness in terms of finances, but also time. There are other disability activists and scholars who have been very recently working on what is called pleasure activism. And this week, the Ford Foundation, which is a major granting organization in the United States that's based in New York, hosted an online series of events related to their new project to fund the disability arts. And they had an event with Sammy Schock, who is a professor in Wisconsin, who did a photo series of herself wearing like beautiful, glamorous, almost costumes with a mask on while doing mundane activities during COVID, while pumping gas or going to the grocery store or quarantining. And she describes that as pleasure activism. And it's politicized at a moment when happiness is very hard to come by for many people.
はい、どうもありがとうございます。そういった様々な活動
So various activities were shared, and Nathan-san talked about bottom-up approach in developing technologies, something that is uniquely Tokyo, and the art in Tokyo is very much related to this topic. Would you like to weigh in? No, I believe that Inatani-san has mentioned about what is human being, and compared to the Western thinking, it is different in Japan. This is how makes Japan very difficult to understand, but it also shows possibilities.
Working on the history of science and technology, and especially those concerned with people with hearing difficulties, for example. And in Japan, we have a long tradition of art performance by blind people, for example. Have you heard about the tale of Heike Monogatari? No. So this is traditionally recited by blind people. It's a really long story. There are two, samurai clans, Genji and Heike. And Heike is the losing side. I mean, they lost the battle. But this tale of Heike, Heike Monogatari, tells the story of the fall of this house of Heike. But this was traditionally recited by blind people. So in Japan, we have this tradition of assigning special roles to the challenged people. So I've been reading writings on the web while you were talking, and I was doing some research on the web, and what you have been writing is quite interesting. And do you have any insight for that? I mean, what I'm saying is that here in this country, I think we had different ideas about what constitutes people's competence and abilities that are useful in society, as opposed to the traditionally held Western views, if you like. So, do you have any insight for that? I mean,
Well, in disability studies, there's a very, which as it was formulated in the UK and the US, so Anglophone disability studies, there's a theory called the social model of disability, which basically just states that disability isn't just an impairment or a physical condition. It's really, and this is maybe just too obvious to state, but it's really conditioned by culture and history. And I think what you're saying is completely true, that at different moments in time, different ways of being and different physical states have counted as disability or they haven't. And certainly in the United States, industrialization and the development of workers' compensation in the early 20th century completely transformed what counted as disability and what didn't. And there's a wonderful scholar named Sarah Rose who's written about this. But workers' compensation was supposed to be accident insurance to help workers receive payments or rehabilitation if they were injured at work. And instead, what happened was that many, many people with very minor impairments or injuries were excluded from the workplace completely. And they were considered to be disabled and unemployable because they would be too expensive. It was too great of an insurance risk to hire them. So certain, very small things like having one eye missing, which doesn't really impair function at all, suddenly counted as a disability in the early 20th century, where it never would have been thought of as a disability before. So that's just one example of how social changes, legal changes, and actually, since we have a lawyer here, a legal theorist here, legal changes really transform in the modern period the definition of disability.
Yeah.
So I think I really I'm inspired by your vision of how technology can be, emancipating all these people from the closet, so to speak, in which they are kept. For example, because from my perspective, I'm a neuroscientist, and from my perspective, for example, people like Bill Gates. Bill Gates, he actually said that himself. I mean, he's in the autism spectrum. That's what he said. I mean, so he doesn't, he's not very good at communication, but he's really good at writing computer programs. So before the advent of this, information technology, people like Mr. Bill Gates would not have had, a great opportunity to make a big splash in society, right? So I think this is a beautiful example of how technology can help people with, non-typical ability spectrum, so to speak, to make himself or herself, heard in society. And don't you think this is a wonderful opportunity for these people?
Well, I do think what you're pointing out is also, I'm thinking back to the beginning of my talk where I mentioned how big the category of disability is, and it's so internally diverse. And for any technology, universal design isn't really possible. Some technologies really help, or some technological systems really help a certain group of people and it just exclude another group of people. And even on Zoom, you often find that different disabled people have conflicting accommodations that they need. So Zoom doesn't work very well for people who are deaf or hard of hearing because it doesn't have, at least in the United States, we don't have automated captioning yet. And so deaf people tend to use Google Meet because it has AI-based automated captioning. But blind people in the United States, as Dr. Ito said, do tend to use Zoom. So you have two different groups. Zoom works for one and not for another. And I think the other thing that's been interesting to me recently is that some of the bigger tech companies in the US have started to pay more attention to disability. There's a conference next week called Site Tech Global that's completely online. That TechCrunch, which is like it's been around for over 10 years, a technology news aggregator, is co-hosting about AI, technology, and blindness. And it's a bunch of different, engineers and computer scientists, but also blind people, talking about both the biases and the affordances of AI technology. Because, of course, any category of technology is, even for one group of people, like just for blind people, will have certain elements of it, like self-driving cars, that are positive and that create new possibilities, but there still may be biases embedded. So this is why groups are trying to get disabled people involved at the start of the design process rather than retrofitting.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
なんかお話を伺っていると、
I think the ability or the capability has to redefine, having listened to all the stories, like Bill Gates, with the technology introduction, now a new capability can be identified. It doesn't have to be super ability, but ordinary capability. How is it going to be defined in the network? Even if you are not able to do something, but together with other people, you can do. For example, the dementia people. They may forget easily, but the people surrounding himself or herself, if they remember on behalf of him or her, then there is no problem. Therefore, any specific ability that is closely attached to a specific individual, but instead of that, we can redefine it in the network of people. And I think that kind of a concept then can be invented. I think legally speaking, are there any things that we have to pay attention to? I think how the subjectivities are going to be defined, or agency, excuse me. So for ordinary people in the Western civilization, and that is supposed to be the entity in order to create the framework, legal framework. For example, the assistants and that the decision making is going to be divided, and so that the agencies, the intention can be protected, and then the companion role can be played by AI. That will enhance the horizon. However, in the legal world, how the agencies are going to be supported. There was no extensive discussion in the past, so this is a new area we have to explore going forward. In Japan, I think this kind of area is going to be somewhat good. Professor Ito is really into this kind of area. In our own culture, the contact with the other people is extremely important. So the agency and the patient, how they're going to be interrelated. There is kind of a room for maneuvering in our own culture. That could be one area we could explore. And in fact, the corporate crimes or offenses, even if it is committed by one individual, but the commitment was made because of the relationships with the other people inside the organization. I think this concept of agency is maybe a small matter, but extremely important. as we have the alter ego, the robot, how should I call it? Well, she. I want to call her, call the robot her, but probably it is a robot, so I will just call it it. So depending on the situation, the entity itself may change its nature. I have one question. I have a question for Mr. Inatani. So in determining or fixing the legal framework, there should be the democratic process to be in place. I think you have emphasized that in your talk. But going forward, whether the laws are going to be formulated in that way, continue to be in that way. For one thing, there is dysfunctioning democracy. But it does not mean that we should live in an authoritarian state. But I wonder whether the common rules are going to be formulated under democracy, because there are going to be different stakeholders, there are going to be different agents to be involved. That is for one thing. And then, in addition to that, another factor I should emphasize is that AI, for example, it is different from human beings, but it can behave similar to human beings. So how we are going to deal with them, AI, how we are going to position AI in our society, who is going to be responsible for drafting laws? I think there are going to be a lot of the uncertainties. So with regard to the first question, I think the way we manage democracy should be changed. Currently, the voters just cast ballots, and that's it. But there are those things, those campaign promises by the political leaders. There are different kind of layers with regard to the level of interest. And the people are going to prioritize on some issues ahead of others. I think that kind of approach can be adopted in society. And with the support of AI, that we will be able to sort out who is going to be interested in what issue. So there's that kind of a concierge role to be performed by AI. And in that way, that kind of approach may be possible. And another thing is about the responsibility of AI itself. It is a tricky question, as a matter of fact. Now, thinking of the AI's responsibility, it is difficult to punish it if it is going to do something wrong. And we have to make a change to the behavior of AI. That is supposed to be the accountability that we have and to demonstrate. The moral agent, the AI should serve as a moral agent. That means we have to guarantee that AI can change. But they are supposed to be different entities from human beings. We can't treat them as human beings, but not as objects as well. So it is going to be in between. And for that to be achieved, we have to come back to the original issue. So the democracy with some kind of gradations.
よろしいですか。はい、これは本当
Now, this is a topic that we can discuss for a very long time, because this will pertain to the design of society. I think we should continue to discuss this topic. But with this, we would like to bring this session to a close. Thank you very much to the three panelists, as well as to Saya-san.